Have you ever wondered what it feels like to live alone in a world scorched by war, yet find unexpected encounters that could change everything? She lived in a cabin made of ashes until 8 riders came with the smoke of old wars, tells the story of Lira, a woman who survives amidst the remnants of destruction, only to face the arrival of 8 mysterious riders carrying echoes of past battles. As the smoke rises from her burnt cabin and the riders approach cautiously, she must decide between fear and trust, isolation and connection. This cinematic Wild West tale explores themes of resilience, courage, and the human capacity to rebuild and adapt in the harshest of environments. Witness the tension, the dramatic confrontations, and the fleeting moments of understanding that unfold in a land where survival is everything. Perfect for fans of emotional Western storytelling, this story captures the spirit of frontier life, the weight of past conflicts, and the subtle power of unexpected alliances. The cabin was built from the bones of fire, its walls blackened by the same flames that had once devoured the valley. And to those who stumbled across it, it looked less like a home and more like a scar that refused to close. But for her, it had become the only shelter left in a world that had long ago chosen to forget her name. Morning after morning, she woke with the same brittle light spilling through cracks in the boards, the sound of wind carrying with it the faint scent of cinder that never seemed to leave this place. And she told herself that maybe, if she stayed among these ashes long enough, the world would finally forget the wars that had made her. Yet even as she chopped wood with calloused hands and drew water from the brittle creek that ran sluggish with dust, memories pressed at the edges of her silence, the thunder of hooves in the night, the screams of men falling in fire, the weight of smoke in her lungs as she crawled through rubble, searching for her brother who never came back. She lived with that silence, lived with the ghosts that prowled at the edges of the fields when the moon rose and the wind shifted. And some nights she swore she heard their voices in the rattling boards of the cabin, asking her why she still lived when they did not, asking her what she was waiting for. And though she had no answer, she kept her rifle propped by the door and a prayer into the wooden beam above her bed. Because survival was not a choice here, it was the only language left to her. Years had passed, or maybe only seasons' time was a river that no longer flowed straight but circled itself, curling back into memories and scars, and she had come to think of herself as invisible, a shadow in a land that had no place for names. Until the evening, the horizon trembled with dust, and from it emerged the silhouettes of 8 riders, black against the sinking sun, their shapes long and deliberate as if carved by the hand of some forgotten story. And though she could not yet see their faces, the smell of smoke carried ahead of them, old and bitter, the kind that belonged not to campfires, but to battlefields. And in that moment, standing barefoot in the doorway of her cabin, rifle clutched in shaking hands, she knew that whatever wars she had buried in silence were not finished. They had simply taken their time finding her. And now, with the dust growing heavier and the hoofbeats shaking the earth, they had come to drag her name back into the fire she thought she had outlived. What do you think? Are these 8 riders coming as enemies, or do they carry something she has been waiting for? The second night brought no peace. Lira sat by the cracked hearth, a thin flame barely breathing in the blackened wood. The cabin walls whispered in the drafts, creaking as though they remembered the firestorm that had birthed them. Her father had once said that a cabin built of ashes carried memory like a scar. It never healed, only held the story of its wound. She had grown used to silence, to the companionship of smoke that curled in corners, but that silence was ruptured when she stepped outside and saw them. 8 riders, lined against the far ridge, their silhouettes long and unyielding in the bleeding dusk. They did not move, only watched, their figures framed by the last light of the day, as if they had been carved out of shadow. Each carried a saddlebag, and from those bags, faint threads of smoke trailed, writhing into the crimson sky. Her first thought was not fear, but recognition, not of them, but of the air around them. It was the same air her father had carried home from battlefields, the scent of black powder and grief, clinging to him like another skin. She felt it now, heavy, invisible, reaching into her lungs. The riders brought not only themselves, but the smoke of wars she had only heard of, wars that had ended before her own birth, yet lived on in the marrow of men. She tightened her grip on the axe handle, still resting by the porch. The wood was splintered, stained from a dozen winters' worth of cutting, but it gave her spine a kind of borrowed courage. The riders made no approach that night. They lingered at the ridge until the last of the sun vanished, then melted into the dark, leaving only the memory of their watching eyes behind. Lira could not sleep, not truly. Dreams came jagged, broken, filled with her father's voice calling from fields she had never seen. His words scattered like gunfire across the plains. When dawn returned, she found the first sign they had not been mere shadows. At the base of the ridge lay a rusted helmet, older than her years, the crest charred and broken. Beside it, a strip of cloth burned to its threads, marked with symbols she did not recognize. She touched it, and her fingers came away blackened, as though the war it carried still smoldered. That was when she realized the riders carried not only ashes, but time itself, fragments of battles that would not stay buried. They had come for her, or for the cabin, or perhaps for both, and their arrival meant that the war her father had tried to leave behind had finally found its way to her door, and as the wind carried the smoke into her cabin that morning, Lira whispered to herself the only truth she dared speak. The past is not done. It only waits. The sound of hooves carried across the plains like a heartbeat that wouldn't stop. Mara stood at the edge of the ash-marked clearing, her cabin behind her, her eyes fixed on the line of figures cutting their way through the heat shimmer. There were 8 of them, 8 riders who looked less like men and more like phantoms born from the wars that had scarred the land. Each horse moved with the slow, deliberate weariness of a beast carrying too much for too long, and each saddle bulged with heavy leather packs, tied shut but leaking the faint, unmistakable scent of char and bone. Mara didn't need to open them to know they carried ashes. Ashes of men who had once ridden under flags and prayers. Ashes of lives burned down to dust. The smoke of old wars had found her at last. She felt her breath catch in her chest as she recognized the look in their eyes. It was not the gaze of men seeking land, food, or coin. It was the haunted, hollow look of men who carried the weight of ghosts. The lead rider was older, his beard black streaked with gray, his coat tattered, like a banner too long in the wind. He removed his hat slowly as he drew closer, revealing eyes that burned with something not entirely human eyes that seemed to see into the past and into her. "You live in the cabin of ashes," he said, his voice low and rasped, as though smoke lived in his lungs. "You live where the fire ended, but the war never did." Mara didn't answer at first. She let the silence stretch, her hands resting at her sides, her fingers close to the handle of her rifle, though she didn't raise it. Her father had always told her, "Don't point your weapon at ghosts, because you can't kill what's already dead." She wasn't sure if these men were ghosts, but the ash-stained light in their faces made her believe it. Finally she asked, "What do you carry?" Her voice was steady, but her throat felt like stone. The second rider, younger and harder in his expression, tugged at the strap of his saddlebag. The leather shifted, and a small cloud of gray dust puffed into the air, catching the sunlight like sparks. "Ashes," he said, "the last remains of the ones we rode with. We bring them to where the fires were born. We bring them to rest where the war ended." Mara's chest tightened. Her father had spoken of this, how men would one day come, not with guns drawn, but with the weight of burned years. The war her father had fought in, the war that had taken his brothers, had not ended in peace, only in silence. And silence, she knew too well, was not the same as an ending. The old leader leaned forward in his saddle, his voice quieter, heavier. We were told the cabin of ashes is where the truth lies. That the woman who lives there knows what was buried in the flames. We were told you carry what the smoke could not destroy. Mara's hand brushed unconsciously against her chest, where beneath her shirt, on a leather cord, hung a small iron key her father had pressed into her palm on the night he died. He had told her it opened nothing and everything, that it belonged to the fire itself. She had never understood. But looking into the rider's eyes now, she felt the meaning tremble awake. "You've brought me war," she said at last, her voice almost breaking, though she didn't let it. "And I've buried enough of it." The men dismounted slowly, their boots sinking into the ashy soil. The horses snorted, restless, the smell of death heavy in their saddlebags. The old leader stepped closer, his hand outstretched not for her, not for violence, but for something else entirely. "Not war," he said. "The last ember, we can't bury it alone." And as the wind shifted, carrying the acrid smoke from their saddlebags toward her cabin, Mara felt the truth unfold. The riders had not come for her land or her blood, but for the one thing her father had left her, the place where fire still remembered, and where the ashes of old wars could finally speak. The cabin stood like a scar stitched into the earth, and Laura had grown used to its silence, the creak of timber shifting in the night, the way soot still clung to the seams no matter how much she scrubbed, the faint ghost of burnt cedar that lingered even years later. It had been her refuge since the fire that took everything, but also her prison. And when the horizon began to smolder with moving shapes, she knew the silence was about to be broken. At first it looked like heat shimmering above the plains, a trick of the dying sun. Then she saw the line of riders, slow and deliberate, each one carrying saddlebags that seemed to breathe smoke into the wind. It was not the dust of the trail, not the ordinary veil of travel. This was darker, thicker, as though they carried the remnants of something long dead, some battlefield no one cared to name. She set her rifle on the cabin's porch rail, her hands steady, though her breath betrayed her. 8 men, no more, no less, drew closer, their silhouettes stretched by the red sky behind them. They rode without haste, without fear, as though the land itself belonged to them. And in their silence she heard echoes of wars she was too young to have fought, but old enough to remember the cost of. The first rider to stop before her dismounted, with a weariness that felt rehearsed, his boots sinking into the scorched soil. His face was carved with lines like riverbeds gone dry, and his eyes held that strange gleam of men who had seen too much and buried more than they ever told. He tipped his hat, not in politeness but in acknowledgement, the way one greets a grave. "This place," he said, his voice like a coal grinding in the wind, "was born of fire. We've carried its brother on our backs." He motioned to the saddlebags, and Laura could see smoke curling faintly from the seams, threads of black rising as though something inside still smoldered. She did not ask what they carried. Her father once told her that some burdens, if named, take root in the soil you stand on. She only asked, "Why bring it here?" The man studied her with a long pause, as if her words were heavier than they should have been. The others remained on horseback, their silhouettes unmoving, like statues of warlords carved from ash. Finally he answered, "Because the world forgot where it started burning. And you live where the ember was buried." His words lodged into her like a splinter. She thought of the fire that had consumed the cabin once, of the wars whispered in her father's stories, the ones where the sky was said to glow red for weeks, and rivers ran thick with smoke. The cabin, she realized, was not just her inheritance. It was a marker. The man did not threaten her, nor did he plead. He only stood there, waiting, as though her presence alone was part of some bargain struck long before she was born. Laura felt the night pressing in, shadows growing longer, the horizon swallowing the last streaks of red. She wanted to ask what lay in those bags, what wars had been ground down into dust fine enough to still burn, but her tongue held. For if she asked, she might never close her eyes again without seeing it. Instead, she gripped her rifle tighter, the wood worn smooth under her palm, and said, "Then I suppose you'll be wanting to come inside." The man's gaze flickered. Toward the cabin, toward its scarred beams and blackened corners, and he almost smiled, though it carried no warmth. "No," he said quietly. "We came to see if the fire remembers you." And then, with the last of the daylight bleeding away, the 8 riders dismounted as one, their boots sinking into the dirt like roots taking hold. Lira felt the air grow heavier, thick with a smoke that seemed to seep not from their bags, but from the very ground beneath her feet. The past was rising, and she could not tell if she was its witness or its prey. The night deepened, and with it, the silence became heavier than any words. Lira sat on the cabin step, her knees pulled to her chest, the watch still ticking faintly in her palm, as though mocking the stillness of everything else. The riders had built a fire not far from her home, and though their voices carried low, she could not make out their words, only the rhythm, rising and falling like the hum of a prayer long forgotten. She thought about her father again, about how his boots had once carried him across these plains with pride, how the world had seen him as both outlaw and guardian, depending on which side of his barrel they stood. That watch had been his covenant, his burden and his curse. She traced its face with her thumb, feeling the cold metal sting her skin as though it had memory of blood. From the fire, one of the riders broke away, moving slow but steady toward her. His boots crunched over the brittle grass, his shadow stretching long in the fire's glow. He did not reach for his weapon, and that unsettled her more than if he had. When he came close enough for the firelight to brush his face, she saw he was older than she first guessed. The creases around his eyes were deep, etched by both wind and sorrow, and when he spoke his voice carried a weight that pressed on her chest. "That watch," he said, his eyes flicking to her hand, "is not just his. It belongs to time itself. And time," he paused, his jaw tightening, "time remembers debts." She wanted to laugh, to spit in his face, to tell him that debts and clocks and men's quarrels meant nothing to her. But the words stuck in her throat. She managed only, "It was my father's." The man's eyes softened in a way she did not expect. "And mine too," he whispered, almost too quiet for her to hear. Then he turned, walking back toward the fire as though he had not just carved open the earth beneath her feet with a single sentence. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the watch's ticking. What did he mean his too? The thought twisted her insides. She rose, pacing the dirt, the cabin looming behind her like a tomb, the fire glowing ahead like judgment. She thought of running, of taking the watch and vanishing into the barren plains where even the sky seemed empty of mercy. But she knew deep inside that the riders would follow, not because they wanted the watch, but because something in its ticking had bound her fate to theirs. A gust of wind stirred, carrying with it the faint scent of char and iron, as though the land itself remembered the wars they had spoken of. The cabin's boards groaned in protest, and in that moment, Lira felt as though the house itself wanted to release her, to push her forward into the storm these men carried. She closed her eyes, clutching the watch tight until its teeth cut into her palm, and whispered into the night, "Father, what did you do?" The fire flared, the riders' shadows rising tall against the barren land, and Lira knew the answers would not come in words. They would come in scars, in smoke, in the weight of histories carried in saddlebags that reeked of old ashes. And she, whether she wished it or not, was now a part of it. The first rays of dawn clawed over the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the rocky plains. Lira perched herself on a jagged outcropping above the cabin, the wind whipping her hair into tangled chaos as she peered at the riders slowly advancing from the valley below. Each man moved with purpose, not recklessness, their boots disturbing the gravel, leaving subtle tracks that the morning light quickly illuminated. The watch still burned against her palm, ticking in quiet defiance, a constant reminder of the time stolen and owed, of legacy she had yet to understand. The riders paused at a distance, forming a rough semicircle around a low fire that flickered weakly against the chill of dawn. One dismounted first, a tall figure with a wide-brimmed hat and sun-leathered skin. He bent down, adjusting the saddle of his horse with precision, his hand steady as if this small, meticulous act was a ritual. His companions mirrored him, though. Some kept glancing at the cabin with a careful suspicion, their eyes measuring the distance, the angle, the possibility of danger. Lira's stomach tightened. She had been alone for so long, and now every creak, every whisper of wind felt like it was listening, waiting. A sharp cry echoed from the canyon, a hawk overhead calling out, slicing through the tension like a knife. The tall rider lifted his head, scanning the horizon, and Lira realized they were not here merely for her or the cabin. They were tracking something older, something entwined with the land itself, a history of blood, smoke, and iron, and in that realization, she felt a cold thrill run down her spine, the thrill of knowing she had been drawn into a story much larger than herself, one that demanded choices she had never trained for. Her mind raced. She could flee into the labyrinth of canyons, the ash dust swirling around her boots, leaving the watch behind, letting the riders fight for it. But the weight of her father's legacy held her fast. That watch was more than metal, it was a symbol, a key, a map. And the riders knew it. She clenched it tight, the metal cutting into her skin, blood mingling with sweat as she balanced atop the bluff, calculating the first move. Suddenly, the wind shifted, carrying faint sounds of movement, the clatter of horses' hooves against stones, the whisper of leather. The riders began moving again, slow, deliberate, their eyes not just on her but on the contours of the land. Lira's pulse raced in time with the ticking of the watch. The first confrontation was imminent, and the air itself seemed to hum with the weight of unsaid histories, ready to spill over the plains in fire and shadow. Lira pressed her back against the scorched remains of a timber pile, the remnants of last night's fire still smoldering faintly, smoke curling into the pale morning light. Her breaths came in short, controlled bursts as she peered around the blackened edges, gauging the distance between her and the approaching riders. Each man moved with calculated caution, boots sliding over gravel and ash, eyes scanning for any sign of life. They were hunters in more than name, shadows made flesh, exuding a sense of purpose that made her stomach churn with tension. The tallest rider paused, glancing back at his companions, then motioned subtly with a hand. The others shifted into tighter formations, rifles cradled in ready positions, eyes flicking toward the cabin as though expecting the building itself to speak. Lira's mind raced. How many were truly after the watch? How many were here because of what it represented? Her father's legacy had always been a story whispered in shadows, a tale of power, secrecy, and a violent past that refused to stay buried. A sudden gust of wind swept through the clearing, sending ash and dust into the air. Lira flinched as a stray ember drifted past her cheek, a warning that the terrain itself was alive, ready to conspire with whoever moved with boldness. The riders stopped again, one of them crouching near a boulder, scanning the horizon with keen eyes, and for the first time, she noticed the subtle signs, soft footprints, the disturbed dust indicating the passage of someone who had already scouted her position. They had been watching her longer than she realized. Her heart pounded in her chest as she considered her options. The bluff offered escape, but only if she dared to expose herself to the sun-drenched open ground. Staying meant waiting for the perfect opportunity. A single misstep could end everything. She adjusted the strap of her satchel, feeling the weight of the watch pressing against her palm, and knew that whatever happened next would define her, not just as a survivor, but as the keeper of secrets her father had died trying to protect. Stretched and folded in the heavy morning air, the riders advanced again, their formation shifting, some staying low, others scanning the edges of the ash-laden clearing, every step resonating with intent. Lira's eyes darted from one shadow to another, tracing patterns, calculating risk, preparing for the inevitable collision of wills that was about to erupt on the scorched earth. The first streaks of dawn pierced through the smoky haze, illuminating the cracked earth beneath Lira's boots. Every footstep she imagined made her heart race. The ash around her cabin whispered of yesterday's fire, of memories burned and promises left unfulfilled. The 8 riders were no longer distant silhouettes. They were tangible threats, moving with deliberate precision, their eyes fixed on the ash-colored cabin that had been her refuge and her prison. Lira gripped the strap of her satchel tighter, feeling the cold metal of her father's watch against her palm, a reminder of all that had been stolen and all that she must protect. She could sense the weight of their gazes, piercing through the smoke, and the soft creak of leather boots over gravel made every nerve in her body tense. Every rider seemed to carry the echoes of past betrayals, their faces set in grim determination. One hand never straying far from the rifle or revolver. Slung across their shoulders, she stepped lightly across the ash-laden ground, each movement calculated, a dance of survival. The riverbed offered a narrow path of escape, but it also exposed her to the cold scrutiny of her pursuers. She could see the way the fog mingled with the smoke from her cabin, softening her silhouette just enough to offer a fleeting chance at concealment. But she knew it was only temporary. Soon, they would see her, and the confrontation would be unavoidable. Memories of her father's warnings flooded her mind, the stories of men who would cross any boundary for power, vengeance, or secrets. These riders were more than hunters. They were a reckoning, embodiments of everything her father had feared and everything she had prepared for. Each step she took carried the weight of history, each breath measured in anticipation of the moment when survival and courage would collide. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of smoke, dust, and the faint metallic tang of gunpowder. Lira's eyes flicked to the leader of the group, a tall man whose coat billowed in the morning breeze, shadowed under the brim of his hat. Their gaze locked for a heartbeat, a silent acknowledgement of the battle to come. Somewhere between fear and defiance, she felt a surge of determination. She would not be just another victim of the past. She would decide how this day ended, even if it meant standing alone against 8 armed men on ash-strewn land. The sun climbed higher, casting harsh light across the parched riverbed, making every shadow, every plume of dust sharply defined. Lira's heart pounded as she peered from behind the charred remains of a fence, watching the 8 riders fan out, moving deliberately, scanning the terrain as if they could smell the fear in the air. The smoke from her cabin lingered, curling and twisting like the ghosts of long-forgotten battles, a stark reminder of the fragile balance between life and death in this land. Every rider seemed like a puzzle piece, perfectly placed to cut off, escape, each one carrying the air of men who had faced death before and emerged victorious. The tallest rider held something unusual in his hand, a folded letter, edges singed, as though it had traveled through fire. Lira's mind raced, wondering if it was a message, a demand, or a warning. She adjusted her stance, feeling the solid reassurance of the rifle cradled in her arms, the cool steel grounding her amidst the tension. The wind stirred again, lifting the ash and dust into spiraling patterns, making the scene almost surreal. Lira moved silently, crouching lower, calculating every step. She knew that once they saw her, the air would be thick with gunfire and the clash of wills. Her pulse thrummed in her ears as she considered the past, the lessons of her father, the stories of betrayal, and the countless hours she had spent preparing for a confrontation that seemed inevitable. One of the riders began speaking, voice low and carrying across the riverbed, words barely audible over the whistling wind. It was a challenge, a negotiation of power, and an opening in which strategy could be deployed. Lira stayed hidden, eyes scanning the movements of each man, noting the subtle shifts in weight, the way their fingers hovered near triggers, the twitch of a boot in the dust. Each gesture revealed intent, and each could be a fatal mistake if misread. For a fleeting moment, the world seemed suspended, smoke, dust, sun, and tension interwoven into a tableau of imminent violence. Lira's chest tightened as adrenaline surged. She could feel the gravity of history pressing down, every step she had taken leading to this singular moment. Decisions had to be made, and one wrong move could doom her. Yet in the midst of fear, a spark of resolve ignited. She would not let her home, her sanctuary, fall into hands guided by shadowed motives. She would fight, and perhaps, in that struggle, shape the future of this ash-laden land herself. The final rays of the sun burned across the horizon, painting the sky in brilliant hues of amber and blood red, as if the land itself bore witness to the impending confrontation. Lira stood at the steps of her cabin, rifle steady, breath controlled, every muscle poised for action. The air was heavy with the scent of smoke, ash, and the unmistakable tension of men accustomed to survival through violence. The riders advanced slowly, each step deliberate, boots crunching against the scorched earth. The tallest rider, the one who had carried the folded letter through dust and fire, now dismounted and held out a white cloth, signaling a gesture of truce. Lira's gaze met his, searching for deceit, but finding something different, an acknowledgement of her strength and resilience. Her mind flashed through the long months of solitude, the nights of worry, the countless hours she had spent, preparing for moments just like this. The wind whispered through the broken landscape, carrying the faint sounds of distant wildlife, and the echoes of history etched into every ridge and canyon dot as the riders slowed. Lira's heart beat steadily, the rhythm a counterpoint to the tension that had gripped the air for so long. She could feel the weight of every choice, every past decision that had led her to this moment. The ash from her cabin, once a symbol of loss, now served as a testament to survival. With careful steps, the riders approached closer, and the one with the truce cloth spoke, his voice carrying over the quiet expanse. An apology, a recognition, and an offer of understanding that no words could have conveyed before. Time seemed suspended as the group converged at the center of the clearing, dust dancing around them, sunlight glinting off worn rifles and saddles. Lira lowered her weapon slightly, not in surrender, but as a measure of trust, carefully calculated. One by one, the remaining riders mirrored her action, the tension dissolving into cautious camaraderie, the air finally breathing relief. Final ember of the sun touched the horizon, and for a fleeting moment, the land seemed at peace. Lira realized that the confrontation had ended not in destruction, but in recognition and understanding between those who had come with fire and those who had endured it. The ash, the wind, the silent landscape all had borne witness to the truth that survival required not just strength, but wisdom, resilience, and the courage to embrace the unexpected. She stood tall, alone no longer, knowing that the choices she had made, and the men she had met, had forever altered the life of the woman who had lived with fire and ash and emerged unbroken.